Imagine that you were invited to a luxurious feast to a noble lord in the Middle Ages. You see courtly knights, beautiful ladies, gallant manners and luxury all around. Get ready to be very surprised. Why don't you agree to restore beauty before the feast, and why can a trip there cost you your life? What shocks you with a luxurious castle? Why did they carry spoons to a rich feast with them, and instead of golden plates there was stale bread on the tables? Peacock mummy and roasted basilisk. What shocks you about the menu? And why was whale poop added to the food? How to drink wine infused with chicken broth and where to run to the toilet after that? And how not to drown in feces? Why would you definitely not agree to attend a real feast in a medieval castle? So, meet our heroine and Olanda. She was married off 2 years ago. She left the gay court life and now lived in her husband's castle, away from the court, her friends, and the knight Bardolph in love with her. Life in the spouse's castle. Real boredom. The elderly baron spent all his time hunting and she, for needlework and reading, and so on from day to day. Now imagine the amount of information now and then. No internet, no news, gossip, fashion trends. You can't communicate in social networks. And even any casual traveler at the castle gate, and even more so a minstrel or a knight, was a real happiness. The owners eagerly listened to his stories, the latest news, and then discussed them for years. Therefore, it is difficult to describe how Yolanda felt when she received an invitation to a wedding feast to one of the richest families in the country, her distant relatives. No important event was complete without feasts in the Middle Ages, whether it was a successful hunt or the birth of an heir. In Peru, she will see her relatives, friends, and maybe even him, Bardolph. Panda called the maids and rushed to restore beauty. To begin with, she ordered to make her forehead even higher. To do this, the maids applied a composition of lime and arsenic to her hair. Such a deadly mixture really brought out the hair. And Olanda looked at herself in the mirror. Ah, life in a country castle has completely ruined her beauty. There were vulgar freckles on his face and even, oh horror, blush and tan. She told the maids to make her an ointment based on potassium cyanide, and also to shave off her eyebrows and eyelashes. It was considered very beautiful. She will drop drops of belladonna into her eyes to finally strike everyone with an unusually expressive look. From it, the pupils dilated, and a special shine really appeared in the eyes. Yolanda did not know that a constant overdose could lead to blindness, rabies, and sometimes death. After thinking about it, she chose a green dress. And it was dangerous. In order for the fabric to acquire a beautiful green shade, arsenic was mixed into the paint. Textile workers themselves, dressmakers, and fashionistas were poisoned. Here is such a short-lived, but dazzling medieval beauty. Finally, both Olanda and the Baron gathered. It is today that you are happily packing your bags in anticipation of a vacation. In the Middle Ages, any kind of travel is a dubious pleasure, long and extremely unpleasant. The first carriages appeared in the 15th century, but they were a very expensive pleasure and available only to the upper nobility. The cart in them was fastened with straps to a curved frame. This, of course, softened the jolts of the wheels, but they were wildly seasick. In addition, they risked turning over at any moment on turns and attracted increased attention from robbers. The latter completely turned unpleasant activities into deadly dangerous. The roads were simply teeming with gangs, often consisting of soldiers who wanted to profit from something when there were no battles. Traveling alone is suicide. It was necessary to find reliable companions and guards. Our heroes left accompanied by a detachment of servants. Finally they reached the castle. In accordance with the ceremonial, our heroes are met by the seigneur himself at the entrance to the possession. He helped the baron to dismount, our baroness to leave the cart, ordered the servants to take the guests' weapons and watch his horses. To the sound of the horn, the guests went to the hall where the feast was held. If romantic pictures flash before your eyes, throw off the veil and take a closer look. They climb stone stairs and small corridors where bats live, and rats scurry under their feet. In the large front hall, where the owner spends a break, there is always semi-darkness. The windows cut into the thick walls were tiny and, in addition, sealed with bold bubbles from the wind. Glass, which in that era was also not very transparent, was incredibly expensive, and only kings and dukes could afford to glass the windows. To save precious heat, in winter they were also shuttered, and torches and fireplaces became the only source of light. Over the winter, the castle was soaked with smoke, burning and soot, from which there was simply nothing to breathe. It was dark, gloomy, and eternally cold in the bedrooms of the castle, which were located above the hall. The feast was the most important thing for the hosts. It was extremely important not to embarrass yourself in front of the guests. It happened that you had to borrow a lot of money for a feast. There were so many changes of dishes that in some cities they were even legally restricted, as was done in 1330 in Florence. The regulations limited the meal at the feasts to 20 changes of dishes, and that's it. And how can you not go broke after this, given the number of feasting? As a rule, they started preparing for the feast a week in advance. Although there were more spontaneous parties in history, which were supposed to take place the very next day. Of course, the most luxurious feasts were held by kings. One of the first chefs in history, Guillaume Tirel, described in detail all the features of French cooking of the 14th century in the famous treatise Viagnier. He was the head chef of the first king of France from the Wool dynasty, Philip IV, and left a lot of information about how the kings feasted. In the year 1330, the king of France had 75 cooks, 33 cupbearers and 21 bakers. At the feasts of the Burgundian dukes in the 15th century, 300 guests gathered. They only gathered for 2 or 3 days. Now imagine how much they ate. Before your imagination appears a picture of a gallant feast, refined conversations, noble manners, then we have to disappoint you. Contrary to popular opinion about the terrible manners of medieval knights, everything was not so bad, but also not so good from the point of view of modern ideas. No, of course, everyone washed their hands before eating, since they often ate with their hands. But there are problems with individual dishes. Food for 2 people was served on 1 dish. And all this in an era when there were many dangerous infectious diseases and there were no vaccinations at all. Forks were not used then, they were considered the devil's tridents. Each guest brought a spoon and a knife with him, an individual thing, and you can't get enough for all the guests. Not everyone could afford to eat from plates either. Plates in the medieval way are most often stale bread, which was eaten together with what was put on it, or given to commoners. Wipe your hands, and the tablecloth, in general, was not forbidden. However, before that it was necessary to wash them beforehand. The requirements for good manners have not changed much since then, with the exception of one interesting point. Ladies on Peru were not supposed to show everyone their excellent appetite. Women were obliged to eat little, much less than men, in order to remain air fairies. Another nice feature of the feasts of that time is the eternal fear that you will be poisoned. Poisons were a very popular and easily accessible means to solve all their family or state problems. Neither the royals nor the clergy disdained to resort to the help of poisons. The fear of being poisoned haunted the Middle Ages at every turn. That's why all the dishes and wines served to high-profile people in Peru were definitely tasted. However, there was also a super remedy. Each cup was necessarily hung with a unicorn horn, which, they say, would turn black from contact with poison. But since you can't get enough unicorns for everyone who is afraid of poison, they hung the fangs of a narwhal or a walrus. Get ready, while you are eating, a crowd of hungry commoners will greedily look into your mouth and swallow saliva. The fact is that for some reason the owners of the pens believed that those who do not papate would be happy to at least look. As a result, places were always allocated in the banquet hall for the common people, who, although they could not taste all these masterpieces, could watch others eat them, and at the same time watch performances, listen to minstrels, and if they were lucky, they would get leftovers from the master's table. However, such generosity sometimes did not bring the seniors to good. So, during the feast in honor of the coronation of the beloved wife of King Charles VI, Isabella of Bavaria, the audience, tired of just watching, rushed to the tables so much that the guards could not stop them. The commoners overturned one of the tables. The noble ladies screamed in horror, the queen herself became ill. In general, all this bedlam was barely stopped, but that's half the trouble. The feast in honor of the coronation of Henry VI of England as King of France did not go well at all. Hungry commoners simply rushed to the tables, often shoving noble ladies and sending their cavaliers far away, sat down in their seats and began to greedily eat everything they saw. In the confusion, pickpockets were busily sneaking around. The event broke down. Well, we will return to our heroine. Feasts in the castle and in the palace were always held according to a strict ritual. First they brought snacks, then they were replaced by soups. But it's not what you think at all. Middle Ages soups are not a modern first course, but rather any boiled or stewed in sauce. And the word soup did not mean liquid at all, but pieces of bread with which it was soaked. Hence the fact that the soups were extremely diverse. Medieval sources call soup stewed pork stew, chicken with spices, thick almond gravy. A salted net soaked in water with a side dish of vegetables and herbs was also considered a soup. Such a soup was served on Peru at the Abbot of Lagny. The seasonings for these soups were minda, ginger, and even dragées. Of course, there was a lot of game on Peru, but you won't surprise aristocrats with roe deer and wild boars. As for the exotic, the gnawing rodents, dormice, and even hedgehogs, whose meat is believed to have helped with sore throats and leprosy, were popular at feasts in the Middle Ages. Hedgehogs were stuffed with spices and baked in dough. One of the oldest known cookbooks of the 14th century contains a recipe for sweet porridge with the addition of almond milk, wheat, and dolphin. A certain ambergris was also highly valued in cooking, as whale excrement was called in the Middle Ages, wherever it was not added. And King Charles II of England was very fond of scrambled eggs with this very ambergris, that is, whale poop. The climax is the roast, which was served on gold and silver dishes. It's not so much the food as the show. The most gorgeous roast is a bird, a swan, a pheasant, or a peacock. Medieval cooks managed to cook the bird so that it turned out to be alive. To do this, they were carefully skinned with feathers, fried on a spit, and then managed to pull it back, straightening the feathers, and serve it to the table. Solemn oaths were even made over such birds, as on the famous pheasant feather of Duke Philip of Bourgogne, when over a roasted pheasant the feasters swore to go on a crusade and finally drive the infidels out of Constantinople. But the most interesting thing is that such an extremely beautiful dish was inedible. Peacock generally tastes disgusting, it was recognized in ancient times, and there were no people willing to try such a masterpiece. Therefore, having once cooked such a peacock, some cooks secretly served him spira for a feast until he turned into a mummy. But the famous chef chic of the Dukes of Savoy managed to pull a peacock skin on a goose, which pleased all the gourmets who finally tasted the beautiful dish. But even like living peacocks and golden boars and heads, all this is nonsense compared to the real king of the feast, a dish called coquintries. This mythical monster was considered magical, a relative of the basilisk itself, so supposedly brave cooks were able to find and defeat him for the sake of the guests of the feast. It looked really unusual, and there were a lot of people who wanted to try it, because then you could talk about it until a very old age. But in reality it was a creature sewn together from the halves of the most ordinary cock and pig. Of course, the seams were camouflage, and all this splendor was painted with dyes and looked fantastic. Well, our heroine shuddered. At the other end of the hall, she finally saw him. There were 300 guests on Peru, and it was easy not to meet. He saw her, too, and now kept his gaze on the gas. But then the fanfare sounded, all the guests gasped, a chicken in knight's armor was brought into the banquet hall, which was riding a pig. Yes, everyone in Peru had already eaten so much that they could not get up from the table. The servants brought beautiful fragrant pies. The neighbor of our heroine could not stand it and wanted to cut himself a piece, but the pie turned out to be with a secret. Toads jumped out of it and blackbirds flew out. Loud laughter rang through the hall. The live pie was a favorite joke on the feathers of the guests. Of course, they also drank a lot all this time. In addition to wine and ale, sitter's mead was also such drinks as codel and passit. Wine or beer was mixed with milk and spices. Eggs were also added to the pasture. But this is all nonsense compared to the next drink, a mixture of wine, beer, and chicken broth. After all this splendor, a fat question arises: what to do with the toilet? It is impolite to greet a person who urinates or defecates, wrote the philosopher Erasmus of Rotterdam in 1530. That is, you can defecate in front of everyone, but at the same time you can say hello to Nini. Bowel movements in the Middle Ages were not something secret and shameful, but were perceived as something completely ordinary. The rabble, however, coped with the need where necessary, often with auxiliary dishes. But to find out, the castles had toilets, special protruding houses with a hole in the floor, which were called wardrobe. Yes, you heard right, they were called the keepers of the dress, because the smell of sewage killed insects. Hooks for clothes were driven into the stone walls in the toilets to get rid of fleas and moths. Toilets were located either with an outlet into the canal or into a cesspool. A terrible story happened in the 1183rd year in Peru. The floor collapsed at Emperor Frederick in Erfurt, and all the guests unexpectedly fell into feces from a 12-meter height. Under the banquet hall there was a cesspool, which was not particularly cleaned. One bishop, 8 princes, and about 100 noble knights drowned in the cesspool of the castle from evaporation and eroded the wooden floor. The owner himself, Emperor Frederick, miraculously did not drown in excrement, hung for 2 hours, clutching a window fragment, until he was rescued.